Hi, it's Miss Parrott, and this video is about food chains and food webs, just like the one you see here. Communities and ecosystems are constantly interacting with each other, and one way that they do this is by eating each other. Organisms exist and have the energy to survive and reproduce because they get that matter and energy from their food. And so we're going to be looking at how to make and how to label diagrams called food webs that show these feeding relationships with organisms within a community. It's really neat. This sort of is the foundation of the idea that you are what you eat, right? Because matter and energy are conserved. Our matter just gets rearranged and the energy just gets transformed. So maybe solar energy gets taken in by plants and is now chemical energy in sugar, which we eat. We take in that energy, and when our body uses it, it moves into kinetic energy so that we can run. So movement of matter and energy through ecosystems is diagrammed here in food chains and food webs. Let's look deeper. Organisms in communities can be classified based on the feeding relationships that they have with each other. There are two major groups, autotrophs and heterotrophs. Auto means self, and troph means food or feeding. So an autotroph is an organism that can make its food by itself. It makes its own food. These are also called producers, and our examples are plants, algae, seaweed, and photosynthetic bacteria. So these organisms, these producers, make food by taking CO2 from the air and water from the ground, and through the process of photosynthesis, making sugars. Heterotrophs get their food, they can't make their own. Hetero means other or different from. And so heterotrophs get their food, right? Troph is food or feeding, from something other than themselves. So the two groups of heterotrophs are consumers and decomposers. Consumers are organisms that actually have to eat or consume their food to get matter and energy. All animals are considered consumers. Then there are decomposers like fungi and decomposing bacteria, and they get their energy by breaking down and absorbing food from dead and decaying matter. In food chains, there's one organism that eats another, that eats another, that eats another. And matter and energy are transferred all the way up through that chain. Organisms in that chain can be classified even further than just producer, consumer, decomposer. So let's take a look. A food chain always begins, its base is with producers, right? Producers that make their own food by photosynthesis. And then producers are eaten by primary consumers, and I put this one prime to kind of show, to shorthand primary consumer. Primary consumers are eaten by secondary consumers, which are eaten by tertiary consumers, and tertiary consumers are eaten by quaternary consumers. Now in nature, it rarely goes higher than quaternary consumer. There just isn't enough energy with these combined trophic levels to support organisms higher than quaternary usually. And then of course, all living things die, and when they do, they decay and are broken down by decomposers that will break down and absorb the food from those dead and decaying things. All right. So let's look at this example of a food chain and label it together. So we've got grass, which is eaten by a grasshopper, which is eaten by a mouse, which is eaten by a snake, which is eaten by an eagle. And so let's label it. We always begin, like I said, with the producer. The producer is an organism that's going to make its own food, usually by photosynthesis. And so on our diagram, grass is our plant and plants are producers. So we can label that. Producers are eaten by primary consumers, So I can label my grasshopper primary consumer. He's eaten by this mouse, which is a secondary consumer, which is eaten by the snake. So a tertiary consumer eats a secondary, so tertiary consumer. And tertiary consumers are eaten by quaternary consumers. So we'll put that there. Okay, one very important thing to note when you're drawing your own food chains is that the arrow matters. The direction of the arrow absolutely matters, because when I have the arrow going from snake to eagle, this says that, imagine it's like the snake is going into the belly of the eagle. It's being eaten by the eagle. Or if you want to think about it, if you want to turn this little arrow like into a mouth, a little Pac-Man, like our eagle is going to eat the snake. But either way, because if you have it the other way, imagine if I put an arrow that went from grasshopper to grass. That means that grass eats grasshoppers, which would be really scary grass. So be sure you get your arrows in the right direction. Now we all know that in real life, organisms don't usually eat just one thing. The interactions, the feeding interactions in communities are way more complicated than that. And so we build food webs, which are many food chains linked together to give a more accurate representation of those ecosystem interactions. So right here, so I drew the pictures. You can just write down the names if you want, or if you want to draw pictures, go to town. But I'm going to quick show you what these are, and then we're going to label these together. Okay, so this is a fox and an owl. That's a weasel. That's a hedgehog. This is a snail and earthworm. These are some dead leaves, dead decaying leaves. That's a vole, which is kind of like it's a little rodent. A rabbit, yes, an owl and some grass. So, how to label these? How do I know which is which? Always begin with the producer. So there are two producers in this diagram, and they are here, our grass and our leaves, our dead leaves. Now, yes, these leaves are dead, but when they were alive, they were getting their food by photosynthesis. So that's why they're still considered a producer, even though they're dead. All right. And so the easiest thing to do is just follow a chain. So if grass is a producer, that makes rabbits a primary consumer. So we'll label this primary consumer. And rabbits are eaten by foxes, which makes this fox a secondary consumer. But wait, let's look at the other side of the diagram. If my oak leaves are a producer, and a snail eats those, then our snail is primary. And snails are eaten by hedgehogs, so that makes him secondary. And if we go this way, our fox is tertiary. But I thought it was secondary. An organism can be at more than one trophic level within a food web. So this fox, in this case, would be the primary, secondary, tertiary consumer as part of this food chain. So we can do the rest really quickly. I'll run through it and we can look at it later. So producer oak leaves, earthworms, primary consumer, secondary, tertiary, good. If our leaves are a producer, our vole is a primary, which makes our weasel secondary. And fox, he's tertiary again, so we don't need to rewrite that. And then if we look at our owl, so we had a producer oak leaves, primary consumer vole, secondary consumer owl. There you go. So now you can see how to recognize, identify, label, and classify organisms within a food web of a community in a specific ecosystem.